Warning, extremely disturbing material is discussed. Warning, grooming and CSA are discussed. Even as an adult, the memories of those experiences continued to intrude into Tate's daily life, leaving him struggling with hypervigilance, nightmares, panic, and the lingering effects of complex trauma. Andrew felt cold all over suddenly. Because once that framework was locked into place, decades of Tate's behavior transformed instantly from irrational pathology into hypervigilant trauma response. Tate never reacted strongly to ordinary people. He reacted strongly to proximity. Older men are becoming emotionally interested in Noah. Men are gaining access. Men are inserting themselves into Noah's emotional life. Men seeking trust. The ghost of a younger Tate had told Noah that he needed to wake up. Stop looking in the mirror. Everything is backwards. The truth was relatively simple, and yet somehow nobody had ever figured it out. Nobody except Serena, a handful of doctors, and of course Andrew. When Tate brought Noah home from kindergarten in 1972, he never imagined that the little blonde boy would remain in his life for the next 22 years. Tate had never expected Noah to stay. He had certainly never expected Noah to become so deeply woven into his family, his home, and his entire existence that eventually there would be no easy way to separate them. Introducing Noah into his orbit had been one of the decisions Tate would come to regret most in his life. Because Tate had given Noah everything. He had given him a family, the literal affluent American dream. Not merely a house with parents who provided food and shelter, but a family that loved him. Two parents who loved one another and loved Noah almost as if he were their own son. Tate had given him uncles, aunts, a grandmother, cousins, traditions, birthdays, holidays, parties, expensive gifts, and an endless supply of affection. There had been kisses on scraped knees and embraces after nightmares. There had been Christmas mornings, Thanksgiving dinners, summer vacations, enormous birthday celebrations, and more presents than Noah could have ever imagined receiving. Tate had opened the doors of his affluent world and allowed Noah to walk through them. He had given Noah security. He had given him belonging. He had given him what appeared from the outside to be the American dream. And Noah had believed it. That was the problem. Because in order to believe in the American dream, you have to be asleep. For years, Noah had looked at Tate and seen the boy who had saved him, the boy who had brought him home, the boy who had given him a life he never could have imagined for himself. But the younger ghost had tried to tell him that he was looking in the wrong direction. The mirror wasn't showing Noah the truth. It was showing him the version of the truth he had been taught to believe. Everything was backwards. Tate hadn't simply brought Noah into his world. He had brought Noah into a world that had already taught Tate how to confuse love with possession, protection with control, and generosity with obligation. And perhaps the most painful truth of all was that Tate had loved Noah. He really had. That didn't make everything he had done right. It only made the truth harder to accept. Because sometimes the person who gives you everything can also be the person who keeps you from realizing what you've lost. The younger Tate had known that. And after 22 years, he was finally begging Noah to wake up. The world that surrounded Tate, Noah believed, was wonderful. The people that had been introduced to Noah, the individuals he knew and ate dinner with during events and holidays, were all sexual predators. Noah didn't have a clue. The American dream Tate had given Noah was a lie. That was the truth the younger ghost had been trying to force Noah to understand. Not a small lie, not one harmless secret buried beneath years of family history, not a carefully omitted detail that could be explained away with a simple apology. Everything Noah thought he knew about his life was wrong. His childhood, his past, his family, the people he had called his parents, uncles, grandparents, and relatives. The people whose houses he had slept in, whose arms had held him when he cried, whose voices had comforted him when he was afraid. The family he had spent his entire life believing had loved him. It was all connected to something so dark and disgusting that Noah could barely allow himself to imagine it, let alone say it aloud. And Tate had known. That was the part Tate could not forgive about himself. Tate had known the truth. He had known it for years, perhaps for as long as Noah could remember, And instead of telling him, Tate had built an entire life around keeping Noah from discovering it. Tate had lied to Noah his entire life. But the reason behind those lies was more complicated than cruelty. Tate had convinced himself that he was protecting Noah. Because if he told Noah the truth when he was a child, Tate wouldn't merely be revealing a secret. He would be stealing Noah's childhood from him. He would be taking away the only family Noah had ever known. He would be destroying every birthday, every Christmas morning, every family dinner, every holiday, every photograph, every memory Noah had ever cherished. He would be forcing a child to look at the people he loved and suddenly see them through the eyes of a terrified adult. And Tate couldn't do that. So he lied. He allowed Noah to believe. He allowed Noah to sleep peacefully beneath the illusion that he was safe. He allowed him to grow up believing that the people surrounding him were his family because, in Tate's mind, the alternative was unbearable. Andrew eventually understood that Noah's dreams about the house weren't really about a house. They were about Tate. The collapsing walls, the rotten wood, the rooms slowly decomposing from the inside out, the beautiful structure that appeared intact until something underneath finally gave way. It was a metaphor for the life Tate and Noah had built together. From the outside it looked solid. Inside it was already dying. Their life was fragile glass, beautiful, carefully constructed, and dangerously easy to shatter. Tate knew there were things buried beneath their relationship that could destroy everything Noah believed about his life. Every year Tate kept the truth from him, the foundation became weaker. But Tate had never wanted to tell him. Not because he didn't love Noah. Because he loved him enough to be terrified of what the truth would do to him. Tate had spent his entire life afraid of becoming his grandfather. His grandfather had been the first person to begin pulling back the curtain. On Tate's second birthday, he had told the little boy that the family had a secret. The family business was illegal. It was the kind of secret that wasn't supposed to leave the family. And Tate never forgot it. For the rest of his life, that revelation became a warning. He understood what happened to people who knew too much. If Tate told Noah what his surrogate family really was, he wouldn't simply be giving Noah information. He would be giving him a death sentence. At least that's what Tate believed. Because the people surrounding that family didn't tolerate outsiders knowing the truth, they didn't care whether someone was innocent, they didn't care whether the person had stumbled into the secret accidentally. The secret had to remain contained. Noah was an outsider. The one person Tate loved most was also the one person who could never safely know everything. That was the unbearable contradiction Tate lived with. He wanted to save Noah from the truth, but protecting Noah required lying to him. He wanted Noah to have a normal childhood, so he built him a false one. He wanted Noah to believe his family loved him, so Tate allowed Noah to remain surrounded by people whose true intentions he could never explain. And every lie became another piece of rotten wood inside the house. Andrew finally understood why Tate had been so terrified of telling Noah. Tate wasn't simply afraid of losing Noah's love. He was afraid that by revealing the truth, he would become exactly what he had spent his entire life trying not to become. His grandfather had given Tate the secret. Tate had sworn that he would never pass that burden to Noah. So he carried it himself. For years. Decades. And perhaps that was why Noah dreamed of the house collapsing. His subconscious didn't know the facts, but somehow it understood the structure. Something was wrong. Something enormous was hidden inside the walls. Something was eating away at the life he thought he knew. And eventually Andrew realized the house couldn't keep standing forever. Because secrets don't make a foundation stronger. They only make the collapse more catastrophic when the truth finally reaches the surface. If Noah knew the truth, Noah would lose everything. And Tate couldn't bear to be the person who took it away. That was the cruelest irony of all. Tate had spent his life trying to preserve Noah's happiness and innocence, never realizing that the lie itself was becoming a prison. The American dream had only ever been a dream. A beautiful one. A warm one. A convincing one. But still only a dream. Everyone Noah thought loved him. Everything he thought he understood. Every memory he had carefully carried through childhood and into adulthood. Everything was backwards. The day Noah came to Tate's house for the first time for a sleepover when the blonde was 4 years old, Tate had invited his new buddy to the darkest pit of hell in Lowe's Angels. It was as though Tate had taken Noah to Epstein Island, and instead of a safe home, the land was built around evil, introduced to Noah by invitation. Tate brought him home to meet and love predators, and Tate told him they were buddies and family. Noah had been taught to see danger as affection and secrecy as protection, because the truth had been hidden beneath the language of love. That was what made the realization so horrifying. The people Noah trusted had become part of the illusion. And Tate had been the person standing between Noah and the truth. Not because Tate didn't love him. Because he loved him so much that he was terrified of what the truth would do to Noah. The American dream was fragile. It was fragile as glass. From a distance it looked solid, beautiful, perfect. But glass only needed one crack. One sentence. One person saying the wrong thing. One photograph. One confession. One memory finally placed beside another. And the entire thing could collapse. That was why the dream had followed Noah into his sleep. That was why in the nightmare, the house had begun to rot. At first Noah had only noticed something small. The wallpaper was peeling and rotting. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet. The photographs hanging along the walls had begun to fade. Then the ceiling cracked. The beautiful house that had represented safety for so much of Noah's life began to decay around him. Wood blackened. Walls buckled. The rooms that had once been filled with warmth became dark and hollow. And then Noah looked at Tate. Tate was standing in the middle of the collapsing house. Except Tate was changing too. His skin had begun to decay. His body was decomposing before Noah's eyes, as though time itself were finally catching up with him. Noah stared at him in horror. But the ghost of the younger Tate didn't run. He simply looked at Noah. And that expression was the warning. The house wasn't really the house. Tate's decomposing body wasn't really about death. The nightmare was trying to show Noah what he could not yet understand while he was awake. The house represented everything Noah believed was real. The family. The childhood. The safety. The American dream. And as Noah finally began to see the truth, the illusion could no longer hold itself together. The house rotted because the foundation had always been rotten. Tate's body decomposed because the version of Tate Noah had built in his mind could no longer survive once the truth began breaking through. And the younger ghost had been trying to tell him the same thing over and over. Wake up. Stop looking in the mirror. Everything is backwards. Noah had spent his entire life believing that Tate had given him the American dream. He had yet to begin to understand something far more terrifying. Tate hadn't given him a dream. He had given him a nightmare, an illusion so beautiful that Noah had never thought to question it. And once Noah finally woke up, there would be no way to go back to sleep. Andrew had spent enough time listening to Tate to understand why Talia had become such a complicated figure in his mind. For more than 25 years, Tate had believed his mother knew. Not suspected, not wondered. Believed. Tate had convinced himself that Talia had discovered the truth and chosen to bury it. Perhaps she had covered it up to protect the family. Perhaps she had looked the other way because wealthy families sometimes protected their reputations at any cost. Andrew knew that happened. He had seen enough of the world to understand how easily money, status, and fear could turn terrible secrets into family secrets. But Talia wasn't that woman. That was the part Tate had never been able to see. Talia had been a loving mother. She had been ignorant, sheltered, innocent, and painfully blind to the darkness surrounding her. She hadn't knowingly or deliberately placed her son in the hands of predators. She simply hadn't known they were predators. And that distinction mattered. Andrew thought about Talia's childhood. She had grown up wealthy, but wealth had isolated her rather than educated her about the world. Her mother had been a wealthy single divorcee who had kept the family's history almost completely hidden from her. Talia had never met her father. She had never met her siblings. She hadn't even been given the opportunity to know the people who belonged to her own family. Her mother simply refused to tell her. So Talia grew up believing that the world was exactly what it appeared to be. She traveled, she studied in Europe, she moved through affluent social circles and met people who seemed charming, generous, educated, and respectable. Long before Tate was born in 1968, she had already learned one lesson very well. People around her were supposed to be good. She had never been taught to look beneath the surface. She didn't understand how the darker side of wealthy families operated. She didn't understand that some people could smile at dinner, bring gifts to a child's birthday, arrange playdates, offer to take a child somewhere special, and still be monsters. Talia saw kindness. Tate was experiencing something entirely different. That was what Andrew found so devastating. Talia had allowed Tate to spend time alone with people she believed were friends and family because, in her mind, she was allowing her son to spend time with people she trusted. She had no reason to imagine that those same people were taking him to isolated locations where they could abuse him away from witnesses. They didn't need Talia to cooperate. They needed her to trust them. And she did. That was the weapon they used against her. Andrew could understand why Tate had spent decades interpreting that trust as betrayal. From Tate's perspective, the evidence had been everywhere. Adults had taken him places. Adults had disappeared with him. Adults had hurt him, and his mother had continued trusting those same people. A child couldn't understand the machinery of manipulation behind that. A child could only think. Mom knew. And when Tate became an adult, that belief had hardened into something almost impossible to break. For 25 years, he had carried the conviction that Talia had chosen everyone else over him. But the truth was more complicated and somehow more tragic. She hadn't chosen them over Tate. She had been deceived by them. Talia had gone through life as though the world were a Disney film. She believed the people around her were wonderful, kind, welcoming, safe. Tate had lived in the same world and felt as though he were trapped in hell. Andrew knew there was no simple villain in that particular part of the story. There were predators, there were enablers, there were people who deliberately exploited a child's vulnerability. And then there was Talia. A mother who loved her son. A mother who should have known. A mother who didn't. That was the tragedy. Because Tate had spent half his life hating his mother for failing to see something she had never been given the tools to imagine. And Talia would have to live with the knowledge that the very trust she thought was protecting her son had unknowingly helped predators gain access to him. Andrew looked at Tate and wondered whether either of them would ever be able to forgive themselves for that. Tate for believing his mother had abandoned him. Talia for not knowing what was happening right in front of her. Neither had created the darkness. But Tate had been the one forced to live inside it. Andrew understood, finally, why Tate's reaction had been so overwhelming when Talia told him the truth. Tate had lived almost his entire life believing his mother had known. For decades, he had carried the image of Talia as someone who had seen what was happening and deliberately looked away. Someone who had chosen wealth, popularity, respectability, and her place in the community over her own son. And then when Tate finally said, "Let it lie, mother," everything changed. Talia didn't know. She had never known. The richest man in California had lied to Tate about his mother. He had deliberately convinced Tate that Talia knew the truth and had covered everything up because she wanted to remain wealthy, popular, and respected. It was an extraordinary lie. And it had served a very specific purpose. If Tate believed his mother was part of it, he would never go to her for help. He would never confide in her. He would never ask her questions. He would never tell her what was happening. The lie isolated Tate from the one person who might have been able to protect him. And Andrew realized something else that was even more disturbing. Tate hadn't only been a victim of that man. Sometimes Tate had become him. The monster had been so deeply embedded in Tate's understanding of power, fear, and protection that pieces of him had survived inside Tate. The man who could hold a gun beside Noah's head wasn't completely separate from the boy who had once been terrified of a gun being turned on him. Tate had learned the language of the people who had controlled him. Fear, silence, threats, control. And yet the moment Tate finally understood that Talia had been innocent, something inside him broke. Andrew could almost picture it. Tate looking at his mother differently for the first time in decades. Not as an accomplice. Not as someone who had abandoned him. Not as a woman who had knowingly sacrificed her son for a comfortable life. Just his mother. A woman who had been blind to something monstrous happening around her because she had never had any reason to suspect it. And Tate kissed her. Then he hugged her. Andrew understood why. Imagine spending your entire life believing your mother was a monster. Then discovering she wasn't a monster at all. She was simply blind. She hadn't known. She hadn't understood. She hadn't been given the information that would have allowed her to recognize what was happening. And that realization didn't erase Tate's suffering. It made it more complicated. Because now he had to grieve something different. He had lost years believing that the person who should have protected him had deliberately failed him. Only to discover that she had been another person deceived by the same monster. Talia had had no reason to suspect anything. She had trusted the people around her because she genuinely believed they were safe. And that was exactly what the monster had counted on. Andrew realized that Tate's embrace wasn't simply forgiveness. It was grief. It was relief. It was the mourning of 25 years spent hating the wrong person. For the first time, Tate wasn't looking at his mother and seeing the woman he thought had abandoned him. He was looking at her and seeing the mother who had loved him all along. And perhaps that was why he held her so tightly. Because after 25 years, Tate finally understood. She hadn't known. And she had never been the monster. The monster had simply spent years convincing Tate that she was. Andrew had initially made the same mistake most people would have made. He thought it was an isolated case. Then he wondered if perhaps it had happened across 1 or 2 generations. Maybe 3. He had tried to give the horror a beginning because human beings needed beginnings. If something had a beginning, then perhaps it could have an ending. But the deeper Andrew looked into Tate's history, the less possible that became. This wasn't one abusive man. It wasn't even one abusive generation. It was a 700-year-old pattern. The Blue family hadn't simply accumulated wealth and influence over centuries. They had accumulated something far more disturbing, a legacy built around secrecy, power, and predation. Andrew stared at the family history and realized that Tate's entire understanding of himself had been shaped by something far older than he had ever known. 700 years. Generation after generation. The same darkness passed from one branch of the family tree to another. And the secret was what made them feel invincible. Anyone who discovered too much didn't simply walk away from the family. People disappeared. People died. The secret survived. That was why Andrew suddenly understood the enormity of Tate's choices. Every time Tate chose Noah, he wasn't merely choosing his partner over his family. He was choosing Noah over 700 years of Blue history. He had done it more than once. Again and again, Tate had been presented with the same impossible choice. The family. Or Noah. And every time, despite everything that had been done to him, despite the conditioning, the threats, the fear, and the legacy pressing down on him, Tate chose Noah. Andrew finally understood why that choice had always seemed almost incomprehensible to Tate himself. Tate had been born into a system that had existed for centuries before he ever drew breath. He hadn't inherited merely a fortune. He had inherited a history, a family mythology, a culture of silence, and a legacy of predators. The terrifying realization was that there was no single monster at the center of the family tree. The monster was the tree itself. 700 years of people teaching their children the same lessons. Protect the family. Protect the secret. Never trust outsiders. Never speak. Never allow the truth to escape. And if someone discovered too much, eliminate the threat. Tate had been raised inside that machinery. Yet somehow, Noah had become the person who made Tate question it. Andrew thought about how easily he could have reduced Tate's story to a simple cycle of abuse. Victim becomes abuser. Abuser creates another victim. The pattern repeats. But that explanation wasn't enough. Tate wasn't simply fighting against the people who had hurt him. He was fighting against 700 years of inherited history. And every time he chose Noah, he was breaking another link in a chain that had survived for centuries. Andrew looked at Tate differently after understanding that. The man standing in front of him wasn't innocent. He had made terrible choices, Sometimes he had become frighteningly similar to the people who had raised him. But he had also done something extraordinary. He had looked at 700 years of family history, and at least when it came to Noah, said, "It ends with me." Andrew covered his mouth slowly with one hand. Noah, God, poor Noah, had interpreted all of Tate's behavior through the mirror available to him. Control, jealousy, fear of abandonment. Because Noah himself did not know the hidden variable either. Noah thought Tate distrusted people because Tate was emotionally damaged. Not because Tate genuinely believed predators surrounded them. Andrew's thoughts spiraled further. Mark. Andrew paused there mentally. No. That was important. Mark would never hurt Noah. Andrew knew that. And somewhere deep down, Tate probably knew that too. Mark is giving money for Noah's education. His kindness and interest in Noah were identical to how all the rich men had tried or successfully achieved by preying on Tate. The reason why Mark didn't hurt Noah is that Mark had integrity, which was something no rich man around Noah ever had. Rich men that Noah had met didn't hurt Noah for one reason, because Tate never left Noah's side, or worse, Tate had lured the predators away with his ripe underage body and allowed the men to grape him instead, so Noah would never be hurt. Which explained something else Andrew had never understood before, why Tate's reactions varied in intensity depending on the person involved. Tate disliked Mark intensely, but not with the same existential terror he displayed toward others. Because Tate's nervous system differentiated between emotional competition and actual danger. The problem was that almost nobody around Tate understood the difference. So every reaction looked equally irrational from the outside. Andrew sat back slowly. Then came the most horrifying realization yet. Tate did not believe every man around Noah was dangerous because Tate was paranoid. Tate believed it because his entire developmental history had taught him that closeness between men and vulnerable people inevitably became exploitative. That belief had not appeared randomly. People learned worldviews like that through repetition. Exposure. Pattern recognition formed too young. Andrew felt nausea twist sharply in his stomach again. Every gay man Tate had ever encountered emotionally closely enough to internalize had apparently fit the same pattern in Tate's mind. Predatory. Manipulative. Unsafe. And if that was true, if Tate's nervous system had spent years associating male intimacy with coercion, danger, secrecy, and corruption, then Tate's entire relationship with Noah became even more psychologically tragic than Andrew initially realized. Because Tate loved Noah. That much was undeniable. But somewhere underneath that love lived another belief equally powerful, that closeness itself endangered Noah. Andrew was surprised by something he had initially taken for granted. Tate had survived childhood abuse, yet he hadn't followed many of the destructive paths Andrew had seen in other survivors. He hadn't become dependent on drugs. He hadn't turned to alcohol. He didn't smoke. He hadn't built his life around crime or self-destruction. There had been a few exceptions. In high school, Tate had been caught with poppers, an illicit party drug at the time, but that had never developed into a pattern. Tate didn't use drugs. He didn't drink simply to escape. He didn't smoke unless something had gone terribly wrong and the dissociative state had brought Jay to the surface, another part of himself that sometimes reached for cigarettes or alcohol when Tate couldn't tolerate what he was feeling. But Tate himself generally stayed away from those things. Andrew found that remarkable. Then he realized why. Tate had spent his entire childhood watching adults make terrible choices with power, secrecy, and fear. He had seen firsthand what happened when people surrendered control of themselves. He didn't want Noah anywhere near that world. That was why Tate could be so uncompromising about Noah's exposure to drugs, excessive drinking, smoking, and the people who normalized those behaviors. Andrew suspected there was something deeper beneath Tate's protectiveness. Tate wasn't simply trying to keep Noah healthy. He was trying to keep Noah free. Free from the substances that could become another form of control. Free from the people who could exploit someone who was intoxicated or vulnerable. Free from the lifestyle Tate himself had spent his entire life trying to escape. Perhaps Tate knew exactly how easily a person could lose control of their own life. He had watched it happen. He had lived through it. And he would rather Noah think he was overly strict, paranoid, or controlling than allow Noah to become vulnerable to the same kinds of environments that had surrounded Tate. Andrew understood the contradiction. Tate could be frighteningly controlling in his attempts to protect Noah. But underneath that control was something Andrew recognized immediately. Fear. Tate had already seen what the world could do to an unprotected person. He wasn't going to willingly hand Noah over to it. Not if he could prevent it. And maybe that was why Tate's relationship with substances was so different from what Andrew had expected. Tate didn't need alcohol or drugs to forget his past. His mind had already learned another way to escape. Dissociation. And Andrew suspected Tate understood the difference better than anyone. Substances could take away someone's choices. Tate had spent 700 years of family history watching people use power to take choices away from others. He wasn't going to let Noah surrender his choices to anything else. Not drugs. Not alcohol. Not cigarettes. Not the family. Not anyone. Andrew stared blankly across the dining room. That explained the contradictions. The refusal to define the relationship. The panic around exposure. The oscillation between intimacy and withdrawal. Tate's mind had fused together love, protection, shame, danger, and responsibility so completely that he could no longer separate them cleanly. And Noah had spent years interpreting that confusion as rejection. Andrew thought back to every time Noah had accused Tate of being controlling. Every furious argument. Every painful misunderstanding. Noah thought Tate didn't trust him. But the reality was worse. Tate didn't trust the world around him. And somewhere inside himself, Tate likely did not even trust his own feelings fully because his entire understanding of male attachment had been poisoned long before Noah ever entered the equation. Andrew exhaled shakily. The tragedy of it nearly overwhelmed him. Because Tate had spent years trying desperately to protect Noah from dangers nobody else believed existed, while simultaneously being unable to explain why without exposing truths buried too deep for Tate himself to face directly. So instead everyone called him unstable. Obsessive. Possessive. Crazy. When in reality Tate had been living inside a survival system built around a single horrifying assumption. That vulnerability invited predation. And Noah, sweet, trusting, emotionally open Noah, moved through the world in exactly the way that terrified Tate most. Andrew leaned back slowly in the dining room chair, staring into the dimness of the house while the final pieces continued locking together in ways that made him feel physically cold. For years Noah had accused Tate of trying to isolate him. Trying to control him. Trying to poison his relationships with the men in Noah's life. Andrew himself had believed versions of that interpretation because, from the outside, that was exactly what Tate's behavior resembled. Whenever Noah got close to someone new, especially a guy friend or male mentor, Tate reacted with jealousy and concern. Whenever another man gained emotional proximity to Noah, Tate became tense, suspicious, and destabilized. Paranoia was fear in the absence of a legitimate threat, the conviction that danger existed when there was no evidence that it did. Tate had never been afforded that luxury. His threats were real. Every danger he feared had a face, a name, a history. Every man who had ever gotten close to Noah earned Noah's trust, and then tried to use that trust against Tate carried the weight of what they had done to him. Imagine being forced to see your rapists again and again. Not because you wanted to, but because he had somehow found his way into the life of the innocent little blonde boy you had spent years protecting. Imagine watching Noah smile at him. Imagine Noah writing him letters, answering his phone calls, trusting his advice, sitting on his lap, sleeping in the perv's bed, or looking at him as though he were some kind of father figure. And then imagine discovering that Noah believed the things that man said about you. That was the part Tate could never explain. Noah saw a trusted man. Tate saw a rapist. Noah heard a father figure. Tate heard the voice of someone who had already violated him and was now trying to take something else from him. Their realities could not have been more different. Tate knew exactly what those men were capable of. He knew how easily they could manipulate trust, how convincingly they could lie, and how effortlessly they could turn affection into a weapon. They didn't necessarily need to hurt Noah themselves, they only needed Noah to believe them. They could tell Noah that Tate was unstable. That Tate was jealous. That Tate was dangerous. That Tate was lying. That Tate wanted to control him. And the worst possibility of all was that Noah might believe them. Because if Noah believed the men who had hurt Tate, then Tate wasn't merely losing Noah's trust. He was watching the people who had already taken so much from him reach across the years and take Noah away from him too. Tate's fear was therefore not born from an imaginary enemy. It was born from memory. Every time Noah trusted one of those men, Tate didn't see an innocent friendship. He saw history repeating itself. He saw the same hands, the same manipulation, the same calculated kindness that had once concealed something monstrous. And Noah had no way of knowing what Tate knew. That was the cruelty of it. Noah could look at a man and see someone he admired. Tate could look at the same man and remember exactly what that man had done. Tate wasn't afraid of ghosts. He was afraid of living men who had already proven what they were capable of doing, and who now had access to the one person Tate could not bear to lose. Even harmless interactions sometimes triggered visible discomfort in Tate. And Noah had interpreted all of it the same way almost anyone would. Tate doesn't want me close to anyone except him. But now Andrew understood the inversion underneath the behavior. It had never been Tate trying to turn Noah against the world. Tate believed the world was trying to turn Noah against him. Not because Tate feared abandonment in the ordinary sense. Because Tate feared exposure. Andrew felt another chill crawl through him. The closer Noah became to other people emotionally, the greater the likelihood someone would eventually say something. Reveal something. Hint at something. Connect something Noah himself had never understood about his own life. And Tate's entire nervous system appeared organized around preventing that moment from ever occurring. Not through manipulation. Through containment. That was the word Andrew kept returning to now. Containment. Tate spent his entire life containing information, reactions, memories. Implications and emotional truths too dangerous to speak directly. Andrew thought back to the blue warehouse again. To the hallucination. To the younger version of Tate desperately trying to speak to Noah through fractured dissociation. At the time, Andrew thought it was symbolic nonsense generated by psychological collapse. Now it sounded frighteningly coherent. Everything is backwards. Your life was a dream, wake up. The everyday life Noah enjoyed without stress, which didn't include knowing the truth about the predators and enablers around the blonde, was the American dream Noah needed to wake from before it was too late. Andrew closed his eyes. Those were not random phrases. They were warnings. Warnings Tate's conscious mind could not safely articulate directly. And Noah had never understood them because Noah still believed the central problem in his life was Tate's emotional instability. How could Tate's everyday life resemble a stable world when he was preyed upon and isolated from telling anyone because Noah would be the individual who suffered if Tate spoke his secrets? Andrew rubbed his forehead hard. The implications spiraled outward endlessly now. Maybe Tate was jealous sometimes. That part was human. But the jealousy itself had never been the core issue. The core issue was fear. Tate had risked everything to keep Noah close, nearby, and emotionally connected to him. Tate's love for Noah was simple, understandable, and natural. Noah was the only person Tate ever felt safe and comfortable with to allow himself the option to reset or sleep peacefully. Tate was terrified that naive Noah would trust or view predators he knew as reliable mentors and father figures. Specifically, fear of Noah trusting the wrong people. Fear of Noah being emotionally influenced away from Tate before Noah understood why Tate behaved the way he did. Fear of Noah internalizing narratives that painted Tate as irrational before Noah learned the truth underneath the irrationality. Andrew thought about Noah's entire life, suddenly through Tate's perspective instead of Noah's. Open, trusting, emotionally affectionate. easy to influence through care and validation. And surrounding Noah throughout childhood and early adulthood had apparently been men Tate viewed as deeply unsafe. What Noah had no clue about was how many times Tate had quietly intervened to keep him safe. Dozens of times while they were growing up, family, friends, business associates, and men Tate knew and loved would approach Noah with seemingly innocent invitations. Did he want to go for a drive? Did he want to go shopping? Did he want to get out of the house for a while? To Noah, they sounded like ordinary invitations from people he trusted. Tate knew better. They were attempts to separate Noah from him. The men wanted Noah away from the house, away from Tate, and away from anyone who might notice what they intended to do. To them, Noah was forbidden fruit, the beautiful blonde boy they believed they could isolate and exploit if they could only get him somewhere private. Tate recognized the pattern almost immediately. Whenever someone made one of those invitations, Tate would intervene without explaining why. "Come upstairs." Sometimes that was all he needed to say. Other times, Tate would physically pull Noah into his bedroom and keep him there until the person had gone. Noah never understood. He probably thought Tate was being clingy, possessive, or simply wanted his company. He had no idea Tate was watching the door. Tate had two protectors he trusted completely, Jay and Uncle Joey. But Joey was the main one. Andrew understood why. Uncle Joey was the person Tate trusted to stand between Noah and anyone who might hurt him. Joey had a military background, a formidable reputation, considerable wealth, and a presence that made even powerful members of the family think twice before crossing him. Everyone knew Joey was watching. And because they knew Joey was watching, nobody dared to do anything beyond the harmless affection of family, ruffling Noah's blonde hair, teasing him, or playfully booping his nose. If Joey was in the room, Tate knew with absolute certainty that Noah was safe. The blonde had nothing to fear. Tate had learned that certainty at an impossibly young age. When Tate was only 12 or 13, Joey had begun teaching him how to handle a firearm responsibly. He taught Tate that a weapon was never a toy and that it existed for protection, not intimidation. Tate was given one with the understanding that he was never to use it except in an immediate life-threatening situation. The lesson wasn't theoretical. Joey and Tate both knew there were men in their world who had abused children. Tate understood exactly what Joey was trying to prepare him for. And Tate never forgot it. Years later, when Noah returned to the Blue House before they left for Brown, Tate purchased a firearm for Noah as well. Andrew didn't mistake that for a healthy childhood. It was another indication of how abnormal Tate's world had been. Most teenagers didn't need to think about protecting themselves from predators within their own social circle. Most children didn't need an uncle to teach them how to recognize danger. Most families didn't require an invisible network of people watching over a blonde boy to make certain nobody managed to get him alone. But Tate's childhood had never been normal. And Noah had grown up believing it was. That was the part Andrew couldn't stop thinking about. Noah remembered the laughter, the enormous house, the family gatherings, the teasing, the affection. He remembered feeling loved. He didn't remember the moments when Tate suddenly appeared beside him and said, "Come upstairs." He didn't know that sometimes Tate wasn't being possessive. He was saving him. And he certainly didn't know that Joey's presence in the room could mean the difference between an ordinary afternoon and something far darker. Tate had spent years making sure Noah never had to know any of that. He had carried the fear himself. Joey had carried it too. Jay had carried it. And Noah had been allowed to remain blissfully unaware that there had ever been anything to fear. What shocked Andrew even more was learning that Tate had sometimes brought Noah with him when he was around Tate's eventual abuser and stalker, the same man who had abused Tate as a child. At the time, Tate had been only 7 years old. And that was what made the memory so difficult for Andrew to understand. Tate hadn't been afraid of him. Not then. A 7-year-old Tate hadn't possessed the knowledge or emotional framework to understand what was being done to him. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't yet understand the meaning of it. The experience wouldn't fully traumatize him for another 8 years. Tate's eventual abuser and stalker had convinced Tate that what happened was supposed to remain a secret. So Tate kept it secret, even from Noah. There had been one occasion when Noah was in the car and Tate's eventual abuser and stalker touched him. Tate remembered desperately trying to make sure Noah didn't wake up and realize what was happening. Then the car hydroplaned. Tate jerked the wheel. The sudden movement interrupted everything. To Andrew, that moment was horrifying for another reason. Tate hadn't brought Noah along because he wanted Noah exposed to what was happening. He had brought him because, at 7 years old, Tate didn't understand that he was carrying a secret that should never have been placed on a child's shoulders in the first place. He believed the secret belonged to him. He believed Noah was supposed to remain unaware. And because Tate wasn't frightened of his eventual abuser and stalker yet, he didn't recognize the situation as something from which he needed to escape. That realization devastated Andrew. Tate's later trauma had changed the meaning of those memories. Years afterward, he would understand what had happened to him and recognize the violation for what it was. But 7-year-old Tate hadn't possessed that understanding. He had simply obeyed the rule he had been given. Don't tell Noah. Andrew realized that Tate had spent much of his childhood protecting Noah from truths that he himself didn't fully understand. Even when Tate was the one being hurt, his instinct had been to keep Noah asleep, keep him unaware, and preserve the illusion that everything was normal. Noah had been beside him without knowing. And Tate had carried the secret alone. Andrew knew it was important to separate the predators from the people who had genuinely loved and protected Noah. Not every man in Noah's life had wanted something from him. Uncle Joey never would have. Joey loved Noah. He had come to think of the blonde as his second nephew, partly because of how deeply Tate cared about him. Noah wasn't merely another child in the family to Joey, he was someone worth protecting. And Joey had tried to protect Tate too. When Tate was still a teenager, Joey had recognized that something was terribly wrong with the environment Tate was growing up in. He had even tried to convince Talia to let Tate come live with him, to get him out of that house and away from the people Joey feared might hurt him. Even when Tate became a young adult, Joey continued trying to give him a way out. But Tate wouldn't leave Noah behind. That was the part Joey could never quite overcome. Tate would go if Noah could go with him. Otherwise he stayed. So Joey adapted. He couldn't always remove Tate from the environment, but he could be present. He visited constantly. He watched. He made himself available. And whenever he was there, Tate knew he had someone in his corner. Andrew thought that was significant. In a family where secrecy and predation had existed for generations, Joey represented something completely different. He wasn't another person Tate needed to fear. He was one of the people who had recognized that Tate was a child who needed to be protected. And he loved Noah because Noah mattered to Tate. Sometimes, Andrew realized surviving a terrible family wasn't about having one person who could save you. It was about finding the few people willing to stand beside you. For Tate, Joey had been one of those people. And for Noah, Joey had become family in the truest sense of the word. Tate did not react negatively or equally to every man in Noah's life. His nervous system categorized people. Some triggered irritation. Others triggered terror. And Andrew no longer believed those distinctions were random. The horrifying possibility forming now was that Tate had recognized patterns Noah himself never saw because Tate understood predatory behavior intimately enough to detect it early. Not intellectually. Instinctively. Andrew's chest tightened painfully. What happened to you? Because nobody became this hyper-aware of exploitation accidentally. Nobody built an entire identity around intercepting danger unless danger had once reached them first. And suddenly, Andrew understood another sentence Tate had once said that made no sense at the time. Tate would become Noah, but Tate would never allow Noah to become a Tate. At the time, Andrew interpreted it as dependency. Identity fusion. Romantic obsession. Now it sounded entirely different. Now it sounded like a sacrifice. Not a healthy sacrifice. Not rational sacrifice. Trauma sacrifice. The kind built inside children who learn too early that suffering can sometimes be redirected. Transferred. Absorbed. Andrew felt sick again. Because if his interpretation was correct, then Tate had spent years consciously positioning himself between Noah and perceived predators over and over again. Allowing attention to redirect toward himself. Taking emotional impact on himself. Managing situations himself. Intercepting proximity himself, not because he enjoyed control. Because he believed being a Tate meant becoming damaged by violation, sexual abuse, manipulation, exploitation, or assault. Tate became a Noah, a person who was unaware of the truth, an innocent that could relax, feel normal and safe around someone like the blonde, an individual who didn't have to worry about predators whenever he felt safe around Noah. And somewhere inside himself, Tate had accepted long ago that he himself was already ruined enough to survive it. But Noah was not. Andrew stared blankly at the rain-dark kitchen window. Fucking hell. That explained the impossible contradiction that had confused everyone for years. Why Tate simultaneously loved Noah obsessively while refusing to fully claim him publicly. Because Tate's feelings toward Noah had never existed cleanly inside romance alone. Protection had contaminated everything. Responsibility had contaminated everything. Trauma had contaminated everything. Tate did not merely want Noah. Tate guarded Noah. Constantly. Pathologically. Physically and sexually. In the terrifying part, Andrew no longer believed Tate was imagining most of the danger. Tate was not paranoid or controlling. He couldn't tell Noah the truth about their environment, so he stayed close and tried to influence Noah's decisions by making Noah rely on Tate to be the leader of their duo who led their daily activities. That was what truly unraveled Andrew. Because once Andrew stopped interpreting Tate as paranoid and started interpreting him as hypervigilant, knowledgeable, and informed about hidden truths, dozens of old situations suddenly looked different. Conversations. Parties. Teachers. Family acquaintances. Men whose interest in Noah always felt subtly inappropriate in hindsight. Men Andrew himself dismissed because nothing overt had happened. Men Tate reacted immediately. Violently sometimes. Andrew had always believed Tate overreacted because Tate projected danger everywhere. Now he wondered if Tate recognized danger faster than everyone else. And if that were true, then Tate's entire life became unimaginably tragic. Because it meant he had spent years screaming warnings in forms nobody around him could decode correctly. Noah thought Tate wanted ownership. The world thought Tate wanted control. But Tate himself likely believed he was standing between Noah and something catastrophic. Again. And again. And again. Andrew lowered his head into his hands. The childhood platonic relationship between Noah and Tate suddenly looked a lot less toxic, and instead was a loving, protective attachment which developed more like the aftermath of some ancient, unfinished emergency that neither of them had ever emotionally escaped. Noah loved Tate because Tate had always protected him. Noah thought Tate stopped bullies, but Tate prevented so much more than his buddy ever imagined. Tate loved Noah because protecting his blonde buddy had become the organizing principle of Tate's entire existence. What victim of numerous social and familial rapes wouldn't protect the boy who had prevented 1,000 more daily and nightly assaults with his simple calming presence and consistent present body, blocking predators' access to Tate? Noah was the only kind, sweet, selfless, cute, non-threatening or non-predatory safe person who had access to Tate, but never abused the privilege and perks by hurting the blue air. And somewhere buried underneath all of it, underneath the panic, the secrecy, the dissociation, the possessiveness, the breakdowns, was the unbearable possibility Andrew could no longer ignore. Tate looked up to Noah as though Noah was God himself. What Andrew eventually understood was that Tate's capacity for romantic attraction was deeply intertwined with safety and protection. It wasn't simply that Tate loved Noah or Jay because they had been present in his life. Both relationships were connected to moments when Tate felt physically protected from violence and abuse. Tate appeared to need an intense emotional bond before romantic attraction could develop. Andrew would have described him as demisexual, with the important caveat that Tate's attraction seemed unusually tied to trauma, survival, and protection. Tate didn't simply meet someone and fall in love. For him, romantic feelings emerged when someone became emotionally significant through shared trauma, a powerful protective bond, or the experience of being protected by that person. That was why Jay mattered so much. And it was why Noah mattered so much. Tate's feelings seemed to form around one fundamental question. Will you keep me safe? When someone had physically protected Tate during a moment of genuine danger, something inside him connected that protection with emotional intimacy. Life and death situations could become the catalyst for romantic attraction because they created an intensity of trust that Tate rarely experienced anywhere else. Andrew realized that this didn't mean Tate was incapable of ordinary affection. He could care about people deeply without falling in love with them. But romantic attraction was different. Tate needed emotional sentimentality, something profound enough to make another person feel indispensable. Sometimes that came from shared trauma, sometimes it came from his instinct to protect someone vulnerable, and sometimes it came from someone else protecting him. That explained why Tate didn't simply fall in love with people who were attractive, charming, or socially compatible. He fell in love with protectors who became connected to his survival. And Noah was perhaps the clearest example. Tate hadn't merely loved Noah. He had associated Noah with safety, protection, loyalty, and the promise that neither of them would face the darkness alone. Andrew could see why that made Tate's relationship so complicated. For Tate, love wasn't merely romance. Love meant safety. And because Tate had grown up in a world where safety could mean the difference between life and death, the person who made him feel protected could become extraordinarily important to him. That was why Andrew believed Tate's romantic attraction was so rare, and why, once it appeared, it was almost impossible for Tate to separate love from protection. Everyone assumed Tate was the one in charge of their relationship. He was stronger, louder, more intimidating. He was the one people watched when they entered a room. From the outside, it looked as though Noah belonged to Tate. The truth was almost the exact opposite. Noah had all the power. Noah could leave whenever he wanted. And if Noah ever did, Tate would be left completely vulnerable to predators. Tate would do anything to make Noah stay. He would say anything, give anything, surrender anything he had if it meant Noah would choose him again tomorrow. His pride, his money, his reputation, his carefully constructed control, none of it mattered when Noah was walking away. That was why Noah was the only person Tate ever apologized to. He was the only person Tate would chase. The only person Tate would run across town to bring home. The only person whose absence could reduce Tate to something desperate and frightened enough to abandon every rule he had ever made for himself. Because Tate didn't worship power. He worshipped Noah. Noah was the boy who had saved him. The boy who had protected him. The boy who had given him something resembling a childhood when, without Noah and the safety of their house, Tate might never have survived long enough to become an adult. Noah had given Tate ordinary things that other children took for granted: someone beside him, somewhere safe to return to, someone who made the world feel temporarily less dangerous. Tate never forgot that. Perhaps that was why his attachment to Noah was so absolute. Noah wasn't merely someone Tate loved. Noah was woven into the story of how Tate survived. And somewhere beneath all the anger, possessiveness, fear, and control was a truth Tate could never say aloud. He didn't believe he had saved Noah. He believed Noah had saved him. When Tate was 25, he had deliberately lured his basher away from Noah. There had been no hesitation, no calculation, no moment when Tate stopped to consider whether he was willing to make the sacrifice. The only way to keep that maniac away from Noah was to give him someone else to hurt. Tate would absorb the violence himself. And Tate didn't have to think twice about it. He owed Noah an unpayable debt. A debt that could never truly be repaid. Noah had protected Tate simply by staying near him. He had given Tate a reason to believe that the world could contain something besides violence. Noah had protected Tate's body without even realizing he was doing it. His presence had been a shield when neither of them had been old enough to understand what was happening. So Tate returned the favor. He never had to think about protecting Noah, it was instinct. If Noah was frightened, Tate moved toward him. If Noah was in danger, Tate stood between him and the danger. If someone came for Noah, Tate could not say no. How could he? Noah had protected him without ever asking for anything in return. Tate could do the same. What difference did one more attack make when Tate had already survived so many? What difference did one more violation make if taking it himself meant Noah would be safe? Tate didn't see the choice as heroic, he didn't see himself as sacrificing something precious. He saw it as repayment. For once he could take the pain meant for Noah. For once he could stand between Noah and the person who wanted to hurt his buddy. For once Tate could give Noah what the blonde had unknowingly given him for years. Protection. The debt would never disappear, Tate knew that. No amount of suffering could balance the scales against everything Noah had done for him. But Tate could at least try. He could take the violence. He could take the fear. He could take whatever that man intended to inflict upon him and keep Noah out of reach. Because Noah had protected Tate every day simply by being there. And Tate would protect Noah in return. Even if the price was himself. Andrew eventually understood something that changed the way he viewed Tate's childhood. If Noah had never been there, Tate might have endured years more abuse. Tate had entered that house at 4 years old, already surrounded by people who could hurt him. Without Noah's presence, Andrew believed the abuse could have continued from childhood until Tate finally left for Brown at 18. But Noah had been there. And somehow his presence changed the equation. After Noah entered Tate's life, the predators who had targeted Tate were no longer able to isolate him as easily. Tate was almost never alone. Noah was constantly beside him, and that simple fact became an unexpected barrier. There had still been frightening incidents. There were 4 occasions involving coercion and a gun, when the worst predator in Tate's life used the weapon to intimidate and threaten him. There were other moments that came dangerously close to assault, situations interrupted because Joey arrived, because someone else entered the room, or because circumstances suddenly changed. Several business associates crossed physical boundaries with Tate. But they never managed to escalate those incidents into rape. Andrew couldn't call that a safe childhood. It wasn't. Tate had still been threatened, intimidated, and violated in ways no child should ever experience. But Noah's presence had changed how accessible Tate was to the people who wanted to hurt him. Noah's body had inadvertently become a shield. Wherever Noah went, Tate went. And wherever Tate went, Noah followed. The predators couldn't easily separate them without drawing attention. Tate in turn became fiercely protective of Noah. He kept Noah away from bullies. He redirected him whenever someone dangerous tried to get him alone. He positioned himself between Noah and the people Tate didn't trust. The 2 boys protected one another in different ways, even though Noah had no idea he was doing it. That was the paradox Andrew couldn't escape. Tate had been trying to protect Noah from the darkness surrounding them. But Noah had also been protecting Tate simply by being there. They were children. Neither understood the full extent of what was happening. Neither understood that their closeness had become a form of protection. But the predators understood. And that was why Andrew believed Noah's presence had mattered so much. Tate's childhood wasn't free of abuse because someone had magically saved him. It was because, again and again, circumstances prevented the predators from getting what they wanted. Joey intervened. Someone walked into the room. A car hydroplaned. Noah was beside Tate. Something disrupted the opportunity. And Tate survived. Andrew looked at the 2 of them and realized that they had been protecting each other long before either boy understood what protection meant. Tate kept Noah safe from the people he feared. And Noah, simply by refusing to leave Tate alone, helped keep Tate safe too. Andrew eventually realized that Tate had developed a strange, desperate system for surviving the people who frightened him. Noah's presence was one layer of protection. Joey was another. And when Tate believed neither was enough, he found a way to summon Joey without having to explain the truth directly. Tate would act out at school. He would become deliberately difficult, disruptive, or reckless until Talia finally called Joey and asked him to come to California and straighten him out. To everyone else, it looked like a troubled teenager demanding attention. Joey knew better. The moment Joey arrived, Tate would find a way to get him alone. And then he would tell him what was happening. Andrew thought that was the part that mattered. Tate had discovered that he couldn't always fight the people threatening him himself. He was a frightened child surrounded by adults with considerably more power than he possessed. So he created a signal. "Come help me." Joey always understood. His military background and intimidating reputation meant that people who might dismiss Tate's warnings became considerably more cautious when Joey entered the room. Joey didn't need to make elaborate threats. His presence alone communicated that Tate was no longer alone. There was one incident in particular that Andrew remembered. Tate had been playing with the other children, but something about the game was wrong. Tate had begun pretending to be dead, repeatedly acting as though he had been killed and buried. Joey noticed. At first, everyone else dismissed it as a child's morbid imagination. Joey didn't. He knew Tate. He recognized the behavior as a distress signal. Someone was frightening that boy. Someone was putting ideas into his head that a child his age should never have been carrying. Joey confronted the person he suspected and made his position unmistakably clear. Tate was under his protection, and anyone who threatened or intimidated his nephew would have to answer to him. Andrew understood that Joey's anger came from somewhere deeper than family loyalty. Joey had already tried to get Tate out of that environment. He had offered him a place to live. He had visited whenever he could. He had watched him closely. And now he was realizing that Tate had been using his own misbehavior as a way of calling for help. Tate couldn't simply say, "I'm afraid." So he made himself impossible to ignore. He couldn't tell his mother what was happening. So he gave her a reason to call Joey. He couldn't confront powerful adults himself. So he summoned the one adult he trusted to confront them for him. Andrew found that heartbreaking. Tate hadn't been acting out because he wanted to cause trouble. He had been acting out because, sometimes, being a difficult child was the only language he had for asking someone to save him. The relationship Tate and Noah had was something no one had ever quite seen before. Not because it was impossible to understand, but because everyone was looking at it from the wrong direction. Everything about them appeared backwards. Noah believed Tate had invited him into his life because Tate wanted companionship. He thought Tate wanted someone beside him at night, someone to talk to, someone who would make the enormous house feel less empty. That was the illusion. The truth was far more complicated. Tate had wanted Noah there because Noah's presence made him feel safe. If Noah was sleeping in Tate's room, then Tate didn't have to wonder who might come through the door. No stranger could approach him unnoticed. No one could reach him while he slept without first getting past Noah. Noah thought he was accepting Tate's protection. Tate believed he was receiving it. That was why Tate said everything he owned belonged to Noah. The house, the money, the possessions, everything. People assumed it was generosity, perhaps even extravagance. They thought Tate was demonstrating how much he loved his closest friend. But Tate meant it literally. What good was any of it to Tate without Noah there protecting him? What was the point of owning a beautiful house if Tate had to live inside it alone with everyone he feared? What was the point of money, security, possessions, or power if the person who made any of those things worth having wasn't there? Without Noah beside him, Tate couldn't imagine what he was supposed to be protecting all of it for. Noah had protected Tate in ways he didn't even understand. He had done it simply by staying. By sleeping in the same house. By being nearby. By being that sweet, gentle blonde boy who had somehow made Tate's world survivable when Tate's own family had failed to make it safe. And Tate loved him for it. He loved Noah fiercely even when their relationship was entirely platonic. There didn't need to be romance for Tate's devotion to exist. There didn't need to be a kiss, a confession, or anything resembling a conventional relationship. Noah had already given Tate something far more important. He had given him a reason to believe he might survive. That was the secret nobody saw. Everyone thought Tate was protecting Noah. And he was. But Noah had been protecting Tate all along too. Neither boy fully understood the exchange. Noah thought he was simply staying beside his best friend. Tate knew better. To Tate, that beautiful little blonde boy's slim body had protected him more than his own family or their contaminated money ever had. And Tate would spend the rest of his life trying to repay a debt Noah didn't even know existed. Tate may have spent most of his life absorbing damage meant for Noah. Andrew sat motionless at the dining room table, unable to escape the realization, now unraveling years of assumptions, one memory at a time. The real truth was becoming impossible to avoid. Tate wasn't possessive in the way everyone believed. Not originally. Not at the core of it. And Tate wasn't paranoid either. That was the catastrophic misunderstanding underneath everything. Paranoia implied imagined danger. Distorted danger. Danger disconnected from reality. But what if Tate's fear had never been disconnected from reality at all? Andrew's stomach twisted sharply. Because once he allowed himself to follow the implications honestly, to stop sanitizing them psychologically, to stop translating them into safer clinical language, the structure underneath Tate's behavior became horrifyingly coherent. Every man, every family associate, every business partner, every older male figure moves casually through the halls of Tate's childhood home. Every trusted adult around wealth, power, status, and influence. Every male and female member of the Blue family, even Linus, one of Tate's godfathers, were rapists. Tate had never experienced them as safe. Andrew's breathing slowed unevenly. Andrew later understood why Tate's reaction had been so immediate when Susie told him over the phone that Linus had asked Noah for sex. To Tate, the statement carried a meaning that went far beyond the words themselves. He already knew what Linus was capable of. Linus had tried to take advantage of Tate before, and Tate remembered that he hadn't asked politely or respected Tate's boundaries. The memory had never left him. So when Tate heard that Linus had approached Noah, Tate's mind immediately connected the two events. He assumed Linus had tried to seduce Noah. Or worse, that he had tried to force himself on him. Tate couldn't imagine Linus suddenly respecting Noah's boundaries when he hadn't respected Tate's. And Andrew eventually learned that there was another reason Tate's reaction to Linus had always been so intense. The incident during Tate's 19th birthday had never been merely a business disagreement, as the family later claimed. Joey had been nearby. He had walked in during what became a second attempt by Linus to take advantage of Tate. And Joey had intervened. The beating that followed wasn't about business. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about a misunderstanding between two powerful men. Joey had seen what Linus was doing to his nephew. And he had reacted as an uncle protecting a child he loved. Andrew understood why the truth had been buried beneath the convenient explanation of a business dispute. The real reason was much uglier. Joey had discovered that Linus had crossed a boundary with Tate again, and he had made it unmistakably clear that Tate was not someone Linus was permitted to hurt. Years later, when Susie mentioned Linus asking Noah for sex, Tate didn't hear an innocent proposition. He heard a warning. He remembered what Linus had done to him. He remembered Joey intervening. And immediately his fear shifted from himself to Noah. Because Tate knew exactly what Linus was capable of. And Noah was the person Tate had spent his entire life trying to protect. Andrew eventually understood another reason the predators around Tate had been so careful with Noah. It wasn't simply fear of Tate. It wasn't even simply fear of Joey. After Joey's death, Tate made certain that Noah would have something else those men couldn't easily overcome: resources. Tate gave Noah $80 million from Joey's estate. That money couldn't physically protect Noah, of course. Money couldn't make someone incapable of committing a crime. But it could make the consequences of harming Noah extraordinarily serious. Noah would have access to lawyers, investigators, security, and the financial means to pursue anyone who tried to hurt him. The balance of power had changed. Andrew suspected Linus had noticed Noah when the blonde was still very young. Linus had watched him grow up within the Blue family's orbit and had probably understood that Noah was protected as long as Tate remained beside him. So Linus waited. He waited until Tate and Noah were estranged. Until Tate wasn't there to intervene. And when the opportunity finally appeared, Linus approached Noah. But even then, Linus didn't force the issue. He asked, Noah said no. And Linus stopped. Andrew found that distinction important. It didn't make Linus's intentions innocent, particularly given his history with Tate, but Linus apparently understood the enormous risk of crossing the boundary further. Noah's refusal was enough to end the encounter. Tate knew Linus' calculated proximity to Noah, the false intimacy. The way a seemingly harmless moment could become something else before a person had time to understand what was happening. But then Susie told him something that made Tate hesitate. Linus had asked Noah. Asked. That wasn't what Linus had done to Tate. Linus had never asked Tate anything. He had simply forced himself on him. The distinction should have mattered. Tate knew it did. Noah had been given a choice that Tate had never been given, and that difference made the situation fundamentally different. But Tate couldn't separate the two experiences in his mind. The shower. Linus. The proximity. The sudden awareness of what Linus might have wanted. Tate's body remembered before his mind could reason through it. And beneath the fury was something even more frightening. The realization that Linus had crossed a boundary with Noah that Tate had spent years believing he could prevent. Tate had protected Noah from men like Linus. Or at least he had believed he had. Now one of them had found a way close enough to try. Tate gripped the phone tighter. Linus had asked Noah. Tate kept repeating that fact to himself because it was the one thing separating Noah's experience from his own. But it didn't make Tate any less furious. It only made him realize how easily the past could reach into the present. Tate became insanely jealous whenever Noah talked about sleeping with Tate's family, or at least the male versions of Tate's family. It was almost impossible for Tate to listen to Noah talk about them that way without becoming angry. Because if Noah did that, Tate believed Noah would be sleeping with them under false pretenses. Noah didn't have all the facts. Anyone Noah slept with who was connected to Tate was play-acting that they were decent people with no ulterior motives when, in fact, Tate knew they were predators of the worst kind. And that was what made Tate's jealousy so much more complicated than simple possessiveness. He didn't believe Noah was choosing those men with all the information he deserved to have. The men were hiding things from him. They were deliberately allowing Noah to believe they were safe, respectable people while concealing what they had done to Tate and what they were capable of doing. To Tate, that changed the nature of Noah's consent. He believed that if Noah didn't know the truth because the men deliberately kept it from him, then Noah couldn't make the same choice he would have made if he had known everything. Tate saw that as coercion, not because Noah hadn't said yes, but because the men had manipulated the circumstances surrounding that yes. They were controlling what Noah knew. They were controlling what Noah believed. And they were making sure Noah never had the information that might have caused him to say no. That was what Tate couldn't tolerate. If someone had to deceive Noah about who they really were in order to get close to him, Tate couldn't accept that as genuine consent. To Tate, sleeping with someone under false pretenses while deliberately hiding information that would fundamentally change their decision was another form of coercion which might snowball into rape. That was why Tate didn't want Noah anywhere near the men he had grown up with. It wasn't simply that Tate didn't want Noah sleeping with them. Tate was terrified that Noah would be manipulated into believing he had freely chosen something that he never would have chosen if he had known the truth. And Tate knew exactly how dangerous those men could be. He had grown up with them. Noah hadn't. What was even more traumatizing to Tate was the possibility that Noah might have actually enjoyed sleeping with those men. That was the thought Tate could barely endure. Because imagine loving someone so completely that their happiness mattered more to you than your own, only to discover that the person you loved had willingly shared something intimate with the very men who had raped Tate. Imagine watching the boy you loved laugh with them, touch them, or desire them, perhaps even tell you afterward that he had enjoyed being with them, while knowing what those same men had done to you. To Tate, it would have felt like a betrayal so profound that he didn't know whether he could survive it. Not because Noah would have known what he was doing. Noah wouldn't have known. That was the tragedy. But Tate would know. He would remember every detail Noah didn't. He would remember what those men had taken from him while Noah experienced them as desirable, trustworthy people. And if Noah had genuinely enjoyed being with them, Tate feared there would be no way to reconcile those two realities. Noah could say, "I didn't know." Tate would believe him. Noah could say they seemed kind. Tate would understand why. Noah could say, "I had no idea what they had done to you." Tate would know that was true. And still, some wounded part of Tate would feel betrayed. That was the cruelest part of trauma. The betrayal wouldn't necessarily come from Noah's intentions. It would come from what Tate's mind would make Noah's choice mean. The boy Tate loved had found pleasure in people who had made Tate suffer. Tate knew Noah would never have chosen them if he had known the truth. But knowing that intellectually wouldn't necessarily protect Tate from the emotional devastation of seeing it happen. He could forgive ignorance. He could forgive Noah for not knowing. What Tate wasn't sure he could forgive was the image itself, the image of Noah being happy with the men Tate remembered only through pain. That was the kind of wound Tate feared would never completely heal. Andrew felt physically cold. Everyone had spent years trying to teach Tate that his fear was irrational. Meanwhile, Tate may have spent those same years silently carrying knowledge no one else possessed. Knowledge no child should ever possess. Andrew pressed trembling fingers against his temple. Tate wasn't trying to control Noah. He was trying to keep Noah alive emotionally. Every person who visited Tate's house and were daily occurrences in Noah's life had attempted or successfully raped Tate, and there was no way Tate could warn Noah without the truth surfacing. Tate was terrified that he'd lose Noah if the blonde realized the truth, so Tate chose to remain present in the room when Noah was surrounded by predators so nothing could happen. These bad men had been luring Noah into their bedrooms, trucks, hallways, showers, closets, and warehouses for years, but Tate lured these men away with his own ripe, available body so his bed partner would be safe. Safe emotionally. Untouched physically. Because somewhere deep inside himself, Tate had already accepted something monstrous as normal. That men with power, status, money, or access eventually took what they wanted. And if Tate learned that lesson through direct experience, then every one of his reactions toward Noah transformed from madness into traumatic pattern recognition. Andrew thought about the birthday parties suddenly. The expensive houses. The business gatherings. The social circles. The powerful adults drifted in and out of rooms while children were expected to smile politely and behave. Andrew's stomach churned harder. Because now he could not stop wondering how many warning signs had existed unnoticed in plain sight. How many times had Tate tried to communicate distress indirectly? How many behavioral symptoms did everyone, including Andrew, have pathologized instead of decoding? The dissociation. The hypervigilance. The compulsive monitoring. The emotional containment. The inability to relax. The catastrophic protective instincts around Noah. None of it looked irrational anymore. It looked adaptive. Damaged. Extreme. Trauma-shaped. But adaptive. Andrew leaned back slowly, horrified by the scope of what he might have failed to see. Even Tate's fixation on Noah suddenly carried a different emotional texture. Not ownership. Not obsession. Desperation. Because Noah represented innocence, Tate believed the world would be destroyed if left unprotected. And Tate likely believed that because his own innocence had been destroyed. Repeatedly. Andrew felt nausea rise again. Even Linus. The thought hit him hard enough to make him physically tense. One of Tate's godfathers. Trusted. Respected. Integrated into the family structure deeply enough, nobody would question his presence. Andrew remembered the way Tate reacted around him now. Subtle tension. Avoidance disguised as politeness. Emotional shutdown afterward. At the time, Andrew barely registered it consciously. Now he saw it everywhere. And suddenly the social world around Tate's childhood no longer looked polished and safe. It looked predatory. A maze filled with powerful men protected by reputation, status, wealth, and proximity. And trapped inside it had been a boy learning silently that no one was going to stop them, or if his authority figures knew, they would enable abusers instead of calling the police. So Tate adapted. Protected. Monitored. Intercepted. Contained. Especially once Noah entered the picture. Tate used Noah at the beginning to protect his own body by standing or sleeping beside Noah until men began to notice Noah. Tate then took over Noah's role and protected the blonde's body every day. Andrew's chest tightened painfully. Because Noah never knew. Noah moved through those environments openly, warmly, and trustingly. Exactly the kind of person predators targeted. Noah was an orphan from a penniless, vulnerable background. Noah couldn't fight back or hire a good lawyer, so Tate prevented harm. Tate gave Noah $80 million from Joey before Tate married Chloe, so Noah would have resources that made him untouchable to predators. And Tate, already damaged, already hyper-aware, already psychologically shaped by victimization, would have viewed Noah as catastrophically vulnerable. That explained everything. Why did Tate never want Noah alone with certain people? Why did he constantly insert himself? Why did he react violently sometimes? Why did he panic whenever Noah trusted people too quickly? Why did he never relax? Why was Tate jealous of Noah's relationships with men Tate loved and Noah trusted? Andrew shut his eyes again. Tate was terrified. Not metaphorically. Not irrationally. Terrified in the way survivors become terrified after learning exactly what predators are capable of behind closed doors. And everyone around him had mistaken that terror for pathology. Tate was terrified that Mark's gift of college tuition coverage was a ruse to control and gain access by coercion into Noah's pants. Tate had received 100 sugar daddy offers when he graduated high school from older men, and Tate recognized the pattern. Andrew thought about how many times Noah had called Tate controlling, but Noah didn't understand the context or the predators involved. How many times did Noah accuse him of overreacting? How many fights centered around Noah wanting independence from Tate's suffocating protectiveness? Tate's protectiveness was the only reason Noah didn't suffer from PTSD and nightmares from surviving multiple rapes. Noah only knew about the one attempted grape against him when Tate's brother-in-law Derek tried to sit on Noah in bed, and Tate later threw the rapist out the window. And suddenly, Andrew pitied both of them so deeply it almost hurt. Because Noah never understood the real reason Tate watched everything so closely. Tate wouldn't tell him. Of course he wouldn't. How could he? Powerful rich men who Tate knew wouldn't allow anyone to know the truth about what they were doing. If Tate told Noah, the predators would probably kill the boys to silence any possibility of legal consequences. How could Tate possibly explain? Every man you met in your childhood wanted to corrupt you. Poor Noah had no clue that he was daily tripping over hundreds of grapists. 4 of these pervs ate breakfast next to Noah at the same table during dinner parties, and within Tate's world lived many predators who had already offended with Tate and then turned their privates towards Noah. Tate thought, every room you walk into scares me because I know what can happen inside rooms adults think children don't remember. Every time you leave with someone, my nervous system believes I may never get you back unchanged. Andrew's throat tightened. No wonder Tate's mind shattered under pressure. No wonder his body collapsed into episodes. No wonder his entire identity fused around protection. He had built himself into a shield because somewhere long ago, nobody shielded him. In the most tragic part of all, Andrew no longer believed Tate saw himself as worth saving in the same way Noah was. That was the hidden wound underneath everything. Tate accepted danger toward himself almost casually sometimes. But Noah. Never Noah. Because in Tate's mind, Noah still represented the one thing Tate himself had lost long ago. Innocence, the chance to remain untouched by what powerful men do when nobody stops them. Andrew sat alone in the dining room while the house remained quiet around him, the weight of realization settling deeper and deeper until it no longer felt like theory. It felt like morning. Not for Tate physically. For the version of Tate everyone thought existed. Because now Andrew understood something that made every past conversation feel distorted in retrospect. Everyone believed Tate suffered from paranoia and psychosis because nobody realized the fear underneath his behavior came from memory instead of imagination. That distinction mattered more than anyone understood. Andrew rubbed his eyes slowly. Paranoia implied false danger. Psychosis implied detachment from reality. But trauma, real trauma, blurred those definitions in ways people outside survival conditioning almost never understood correctly. If someone survived years of exploitation, coercion, predation, or violation, then their fear stopped functioning like ordinary fear. Their nervous system adapted. The threat became permanent. Hypervigilance became permanent. Suspicion became permanent. And eventually, the body stopped distinguishing between past danger and potential future danger. Andrew exhaled shakily. That was not insanity. That was conditioning. Severe conditioning. Tate did dissociate. That much was obvious. He hallucinated during episodes. His perception fractured under overwhelming emotional stress. Every personality that emerged when Tate dissociated was, in its own way, a predator. They were not simply different moods or strange variations of Tate's personality. Each one carried the imprint of someone who had preyed upon Tate when he was a young man, someone who had frightened him, controlled him, violated his trust, or taught him that survival sometimes meant becoming someone else entirely. Noah had met all of them. He had spoken to them, watched them change, and learned their mannerisms without initially understanding what they represented. He knew that sometimes Tate could look at him with an expression that didn't belong to the Tate he knew, speak in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere else, or suddenly become cold and calculating. Noah had seen the predators hiding behind Tate's eyes, even before he understood why they were there. Andrew had missed it. He had been close enough to Tate to notice that something was wrong, but he had never understood what he was seeing. Where Noah had learned to recognize the changes, Andrew had dismissed initially as moods, temper, eccentricity, or simply another complicated part of Tate's personality. He soon realized that every time Tate disappeared into one of those identities, someone from his past was coming back with him. Noah eventually understood the terrible truth: Tate had not created those personalities because he wanted to become them. He had created them because, at some point in his life, he had needed them to survive. But now Andrew suspected those fractures emerged not because Tate had lost contact with reality, but because reality itself had once become too unbearable for Tate's mind to process directly. The hallucinations weren't random. That was the terrifying part. They carried emotional continuity. Themes. Warnings. Protective urgency. Even the blue warehouse hallucination had not resembled meaningless psychosis. It resembled a memory trying unsuccessfully to surface through symbolic distortion. Andrew leaned back slowly. And suddenly Tate's hatred and fear towards certain men, especially gay men older than himself, became tragically understandable in ways Andrew hated admitting even internally. Not because homosexuality itself was dangerous, but because Tate's formative experiences with male desire appeared inseparable from predation. That distinction mattered enormously. To everyone else, Tate's reactions looked hateful, erratic, extreme. But if every emotionally intimate or sexually interested older male figure Tate encountered during childhood had exploited him somehow, then of course Tate's nervous system linked male attraction with danger. Children learned emotional associations from experience, not ideology. Andrew swallowed hard. No wonder Tate used ugly language sometimes when emotionally destabilized. No wonder he reacted aggressively around certain dynamics. No wonder he could not emotionally separate attraction from threat. His developmental experiences had fused those concepts together long before he possessed the maturity to untangle them. Tate had always been surrounded by people. People who wanted him. People who chased him. People who competed viciously for fragments of his attention as though proximity to Tate itself carried value. And maybe it did. Tate was beautiful, wealthy, emotionally elusive, damaged in ways people mistook for mystery. That combination drew others toward him constantly. Andrew understood now why Tate had accumulated lovers so easily over the years. Because people projected fantasies onto men like Tate. Some wanted to save him. Some wanted to possess him. Some wanted access to the power and privilege surrounding him. Some simply mistook emotional distance for depth. But none of them understood what was actually happening beneath the surface. For years, everyone, including Noah, believed Tate's endless string of lovers represented emotional instability. Commitment issues. Avoidance. Proof that Tate could never fully choose one person. Now Andrew realized the lovers had served another purpose entirely. Camouflage. Movement. Noise. The lovers distracted attention away from the one relationship nobody was ever supposed to examine too closely. Not because Noah was the hidden prize. Not because Noah was the golden ticket concealed beneath the chaos. No. Andrew finally understood something stranger than that. Noah was the mirror image of the golden ticket. If Tate had a dozen lovers, a phone call mysteriously recurring wouldn't raise anyone's ire. The quantity of lovers hid the golden ticket from everyone's attention, which was its goal. The reflection. The emotional shape hides the real thing underneath. Andrew sat very still at the dining room table as that realization settled into him. Because the center of Tate's emotional structure had never been simple romance. Not even with Noah. Noah represented something deeper. A reflection of something Tate could not speak aloud. A living emotional mirror connected to a truth buried so deeply that Tate himself could barely survive orbiting around it directly. That was why the relationship between Tate and Noah always confused everyone who witnessed it. It looked romantic, then familial, then dependent, then protective, then obsessive, then almost distant at times. The emotional categories never stayed stable because the attachment itself was built on something larger and far older than ordinary romantic love. And the lovers surrounding Tate all those years. They helped blur that reality. As long as Tate appeared emotionally chaotic, nobody focused too carefully on anybody but Noah. As long as Tate chased girls openly, slept with different people, and moved through social circles unpredictably, outsiders assumed Noah was merely another emotionally important person among many. But Noah was never among many. Noah remained constant. Permanent. Structural. Not the prize itself, the reflection hiding the existence of the prize. Andrew pressed his fingers slowly against his mouth. Because suddenly Tate's relationships made terrifying sense. None of Tate's lovers threatened the emotional structure as long as they stayed secondary. Surface level. Temporary. Replaceable. But occasionally someone tried to become more. Someone tried to merge fully into Tate's emotional center. Tried to become primary. Tried to occupy the space Noah occupied unconsciously. And every single time this particular lover, named Jay, Tate's eventual stalker, tried to put pressure on Tate into treating Noah as disposable. Andrew found Jay's relationship with Noah particularly complicated. There had been genuine affection there. Jay had become attached to the blonde boy even though he rarely saw him. During the few occasions when Jay visited while Tate's uncles, cousins, or parents were around, Noah would sometimes be there and Jay would watch him from a distance. That was usually all it was. Jay didn't form attachments easily. There were very few people he genuinely cared about, perhaps Tate, some of Tate's uncles, and eventually the little blonde boy who seemed inseparable from Tate. But over the years, something paternal developed in Jay toward Noah. He saw him as innocent. Sweet. Kind. A child who had done nothing to deserve the world he had been born into. Jay would never have touched Noah. Andrew believed that. Tate believed it eventually too. Jay knew that Tate would never forgive him if he harmed Noah, but that wasn't the only reason. Jay genuinely didn't want to hurt him. The cruel irony was that Jay sometimes used the threat of hurting Noah to manipulate Tate. That was what made the situation so psychologically complicated. Jay knew exactly what Noah meant to Tate. If Jay wanted Tate to comply with something, threatening Noah was an effective way to control him. But Andrew believed Jay had never actually intended to carry out those threats. Noah was leverage. He was not a target. Still, Tate couldn't afford to gamble with Noah's safety. When you're dealing with someone capable of making threats against the person you love, you don't get to assume the threat is empty. So Tate obeyed. Years later, when Tate was in his late 20s, he finally began to understand something he hadn't been able to see when he was younger. Jay probably never would have hurt Noah. The affection Jay had developed for the boy had been real. But Tate could never have known that with certainty when Noah was vulnerable and Jay held power over him. And Andrew understood why. Sometimes the difference between manipulation and genuine danger isn't visible to the person being threatened. A threat doesn't become harmless simply because the person making it secretly doesn't intend to follow through. Tate had been right to protect Noah. Even if Jay's affection for Noah had been genuine, Tate couldn't take that chance. Because Noah wasn't merely leverage. He was Tate's little blonde buddy. And Tate would never forgive himself if anything happened to him. Andrew understood that Jay's feelings for Tate had been genuine. That was part of what made the relationship so disturbing. The affection was real, but the relationship itself was profoundly inappropriate, illegal, and taboo for reasons Andrew didn't even want to fully contemplate. Neither Tate nor Jay had grown up with a healthy model of adult intimacy. They had been surrounded by relationships in which boundaries were routinely violated, power was confused with affection, and things that should have been condemned were instead normalized, celebrated, or kept hidden behind wealth. They hadn't been taught what a healthy relationship looked like. They hadn't even been given a clear understanding of who was supposed to be able to have a romantic relationship with whom. To them, the boundaries had been distorted from childhood. Tate didn't begin to understand that his relationship with Jay was wrong until he was around 13. That realization was devastating because it meant Tate had to look backward and recognize that something he had experienced as love had actually been shaped by an environment that had never taught him what healthy love was supposed to be. Andrew could understand why it had taken Tate so long. Children don't invent their understanding of relationships in isolation. They learn from the adults around them. And the adults surrounding Tate and Jay had taught them something profoundly broken. Yet there was one relationship in Jay's life that Andrew could identify as genuinely innocent. Noah. Jay's affection for Noah was fundamentally different. There was no romantic or sexual component to it. Noah was simply the little blonde boy Tate loved, and because Tate loved Noah, Jay developed a genuine fondness for him too. Noah barely understood who Jay really was. To Noah, Jay was simply someone who occasionally appeared around Tate's family. But to Jay, Noah represented something much more important. He was someone innocent. Someone kind. Someone Tate loved without the same darkness that had surrounded so many of the other relationships in their lives. Andrew found that almost painfully ironic. Jay had spent his life surrounded by relationships that were distorted by power and secrecy. Tate had done the same. But the one relationship Jay had that was completely innocent was with a boy who didn't even really know him. Jay loved Noah because Tate loved Noah. And perhaps Andrew thought that was the closest Jay ever came to understanding what uncomplicated affection was supposed to feel like. Andrew understood why Tate's memories of Jay were so difficult for him to categorize. Tate had never understood Jay in the same way he understood the other predators who had hurt him. In Tate's mind, there had been affection between them. Tate remembered seeking Jay out, running down the hall and climbing into his bed when he was frightened. He remembered Jay as someone he associated with protection rather than terror. He remembered himself pursuing Jay at times, rather than being dragged away by force. But Andrew knew that none of those details changed the fundamental reality. Tate had been a child. Whatever Tate believed he wanted, whatever feelings he experienced, and however affectionate the relationship may have seemed to him, a child could not legally consent to that kind of relationship with an adult. Jay's responsibility was to maintain the boundary regardless of Tate's behavior or feelings. That was the part Tate had struggled to understand. Jay hadn't behaved like the other men Tate remembered. He hadn't routinely abducted him, taken him to isolated locations, held a gun against him, or deliberately brutalized him. Tate associated those behaviors with the people he unquestionably regarded as predators. So for years, Tate didn't think of Jay as a rapist. He thought of him as an ex-lover, a fiancé, someone he had genuinely loved. Andrew could understand why Tate's mind made that distinction, but he couldn't accept the conclusion Tate had drawn from it. The absence of physical brutality didn't make the relationship permissible. The fact that Tate had sought Jay out didn't make it permissible. The fact that Tate believed he loved Jay didn't make it permissible. And the fact that Jay believed the relationship was loving and consensual didn't make it permissible either.